This is the Tudors Dynasty podcast. And now, Ask the Expert with Steph.
Hello and welcome to Ask the Expert. I'm your host, Steph Stohrer, and I'm so excited to welcome today's guest, academic historian Sarah Bendall. Sarah is here today to answer your questions about fashion in England during the 15 and 1600s. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah.
No, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to answer some of these questions.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So, fashion is one of those kind of ever-changing trends that tell us, so much more about time, really, than we even realize. It's not just about style all the time, right? But it can also give us a glimpse into culture and the way of life of the subjects. So today's listener questions are so interesting, and I can see why I'd want to research this topic if I were you. But Sarah, what brought you to this topic as your focus?
I think it was a general love of dressing up, actually, as a child. And yeah, I always loved objects and things. I always wanted to be an archaeologist, actually, growing up. And when I was a bit older, I sort of got into sewing, rediscovered sewing as a way to be able to make, costumes, to be able to go to dress-up parties or Halloween, which isn't as much of a big thing in Australia as it is in North America. But and so I slowly sort of started to think, the same way that, as you just explained then, that this is such an interesting way to think about history and to explore history, such an interesting lens. And I started to sort of incorporate that into my my work when I was an undergraduate, and then decided, hey, I'm going to keep researching this, and here I am.
Well, I love that because we're really happy that you've become an expert on this. It brought you here, right? So, all right, let's get to it. So the first thing we definitely have to talk about is that there are so many unfamiliar terms when it comes to clothing and fashion at the time. So first things first, let's be clear that my New Jersey American accent can only go so far. So I'm going to try my best, right? But I'm definitely going to say things wrong all over the place here. But I'm going to start out by kind of just throwing at you all the terms that all of our listeners have written in. There's so many different things that people were, asking, what's this? And what's this? And so maybe you can give us an idea of what a day in the life of a woman getting dressed was, because we have things like a stomacher, a girdle, a kirtle, a ruff, a a farthingale. And what are they all? And were they all worn together? What were the purposes? So maybe you could just kind of take us through getting dressed.
Yeah, of course. It does differ a bit over the sort of 16th, 17th century. So I'll start with maybe the mid 16th century, and then I can move from there. So the basic garment that every woman would have worn, actually throughout the whole 16th and 17th century, and men too, was a basic linen undergarment called a smock or a shift or a shirt if you're a man. So that's sort of what we see in the movies, that really basic voluminous white undergarment that everybody would have worn. And then over that, most women would have worn, so if you were maybe an upper class woman in the middle of the 16th century, you would have put a kirtle on over that. So a kirtle it's best to think of that as a sleeveless underdress. So the bodice could often be stiffened a little bit in the in the mid 16th century. It was usually just with thicker fabrics, maybe some pasteboard, something like that. And so this was just, a basic sleeveless underdress. And then over the top of that, you could you would put on if you're an upper class woman, you would put on a gown, which was often in the mid-16th century had a bodice that was attached to a skirt. It came in various different styles. You had French gowns, you had Polish gowns, Italian gowns, all sort of meaning different things. And then over the top of that, so a girdle, I think that was one of the questions. A girdle was a decorative band or a belt that was placed around the waist or hips. Often it's sort of dangled down in the front of the dress. You will see sort of Tudor portraiture with people wearing that. And then, so that was, I would say, for a basic Oh, sorry, I'm actually missing something. You had a petticoat as well. So a petticoat is one of those strange garments that can mean lots of different things. And I think that's where sort of the terminology in this period can get a little bit confused. So kirtles and petticoats were very similar in sort of the 16th century. It was, well, a kirtle was a sleeveless underdress with a bodice that was attached to a skirt, and a petticoat could also be that. A petticoat, though, could have sleeves, it could have detachable sleeves. Generally, they were red, and petticoats were more widely worn than kirtles. Kirtles seem to only occur in the sort of more upper class wardrobes, and they're generally made from quite nice fabrics, silks, for example, whereas a petticoat was worn by all women, usually red, often wool. And by the 17th century, the petticoat sort of supersedes the kirtle. You don't really see kirtles much in the sources anymore into the 17th century. You mainly are seeing petticoats. So I think another question, and often, so if you were a lower class woman, you would be wearing a smock, a petticoat, maybe an under petticoat. So that was a petticoat without the attached bodice. This is where the terminology becomes quite confusing. If you were an upper class woman, you could also be wearing various layers of petticoats underneath your gown and kirtle, depending on how cold it was. But if you were a lower class woman, you would often also be wearing a waistcoat, which is a lot of people call a jacket, but at the time it was known as a waistcoat. So this is just this sort of a jacket bodice that women would wear. If you were to wear a matching bodice with your petticoat, that could create a gown as well. So there's all these sort of confusing terms, but generally that's sort of, to be very basic, that's sort of the general getting dressed as a woman. And often, obviously, underneath you would have stockings as well and garters to hold up your stockings. There's sort of a debate over whether drawers were a thing at the time. A lot of people say no, but I've found drawers in Henrietta Maria's wardrobe accounts, only a couple of pairs. And so that's in the 1630s. So there's definitely evidence that some women wore drawers in the 1630s. We don't know how often or when, possibly only in winter when it was quite chilly. But I think the other term, stomacher, which is sort of one of, again, can mean various different things. But a stomacher was a triangular piece of fabric or an insert into a pair of bodies. So in its most basic form, it's a triangular piece of fabric that's often embroidered or decorated in some way with spangles, for example, which are sort of like modern sequins. And it would go into the front of a gown or over the front of a gown. And so if you see in portraiture this beautiful sort of decorated triangular piece of fabric at the front of the gown bodice, that's a stomacher. But a stomacher could also be an insert into a pair of bodies, which were basically the earliest corset. So in this period, it's called a pair of bodies. They're not called stays until the 1680s. And that was, so most of them in the 16th and 17th centuries in England were front lacing. So the beauty of the stomacher was that, as your body changes as a woman, women are pregnant multiple times during, this period. Just generally women's bodies tend to fluctuate throughout the month. You could put in this triangular piece that was often boned like the rest of the garment, and you could control how tightly or loosely you would lace your pair of bodies. And so it really gives you that advantage of being able to control the size of the garment as your body changes over time. So those are the two types of stomachers during this period.
You mentioned that the petticoat was usually red. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah.
Is there any significance to that? Why would that be?
Well, it was thought that red was a color that was good for health, so good for the humors. And for some reason, universally across the social sorts in England, They seem to have mostly been red. They could, of course, be other colours, but red was a very popular colour. And it seems to be to do with sort of balancing the humours and humoral medicine at the time. So red was seen as a nice sort of healthy colour to wear, close to the body.
That's so interesting. So now you went through the whole outfit, and how long does it take to put on something like that? Have you ever put on something like that?
Yeah, I did actually. So obviously I didn't really mention all the accessories that you could put on as well. But for example, for Halloween, I made a 1650s outfit. So I can go through the layers that are involved there. Actually, I totally forgot that I forgot to mention a farthingale in my rambles. So I'll go through though the outfit that I put on for the 1650s.
That's great. Do you have a picture of this outfit that you put together?
I do actually. Yeah, it's on my Instagram. I have an Instagram where I sort of talk about, I make things, sort of incorporate my academic research with my love of sewing and stuff like that. So yeah, if anyone wants to check that out, they can.
Okay, perfect. So why don't you take us through the outfit? Definitely take us through how long it takes to put it on. And then we'll see maybe if you can send us the picture, we can put it in our show notes. And we'll definitely give everybody your Instagram account to check that out. That would be cool to, put a visual to, what we're talking about.
Yeah, of course. So again, the basic sort of undergarment during this time is a smock. And then over the top of that would be a petticoat skirt. So not with an attached bodice, because the bodice that we're going to put on later is quite stiff and boned. So you don't really need 2 layers of support. And then over the top of that petticoat, so you could have multiple petticoats. I just had one petticoat. I put a bum roll, which was by the mid-17th century. You had the farthingale, which I neglected to mention earlier. So the farthingale in the mid-16th century, for example, was a hooped understructure. Sort of would become what in the 19th century, I think most people are familiar with, a crinoline. That's sort of the 19th century version. But in the 16th century, it's called a farthingale. And so the hooped type of skirt was known as a Spanish farthingale in England because it has its origins in Spain. But by sort of the turn of the 17th century, French farthingales were quite popular. And so those were either, there were 2 types. There was a big roll that you would place around your waist and hips, a padded roll, which sort of, I guess, looked a little bit like a life buoy, that you would jump, if the ship is sinking, you would jump out. And there was also another type which we call like a wheel farthingale, which was a flat disc shape. So they sort of reached their height of popularity in the Jacobean period. And then by the 1620s, 1630s, they sort of slowly start to fall out of popularity in their large forms. But then they become something called a bum roll, which was exactly what it sounds, a roll of, a stuffed roll, usually with horsehair or wool or cotton, that was placed around the waist and hips. So you just tie it around and it sort of creates a large, a bum, really. And so that would go on over the petticoat. And then over that, I would put on my other petticoat, outer petticoat skirt, which would be the outer skirt. And so if you're listening along and you're looking at the image, that's the brown skirt. And then over the top of that, in the 1650s, in this outfit, was the bodice. So by the 1650s, this particular style, which could have been worn at court, for example, the bodice, the boned sort of bodice was incorporated into the outer garment. So it's sort of all in one. But women also did wear bodies that were undergarments as well. For example, in more day-to-day life, they might wear sort of the petticoat, the bum roll, the petticoat skirt, and then they'd be wearing a pair of bodies, which is an undergarment, like a corset, and then maybe a waistcoat over the top. But in this outfit, the bodice is sort of all in one. It's boned. And so it's a beautiful silk bodice that laces up the front. And that's really the basic sort of outfit during this period. And then you could have a kerchief, which would or a neckerchief, which would cover up, your chest area a bit more. You could have various types of laces and falling bands. Obviously, you would have silk stockings on, for example, or woolen stockings if you were less, well-to-do. But yeah, it's a bit more simple by the mid-17th century than it is in the mid-16th century.
This brief interruption is brought to you by, well, me. Do you love Tudors Dynasty? Consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Patrons get access to all kinds of amazing things that the everyday listener does not. Find out more by going to Patreon, that's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty, and click Become a Patron for details. All right, back to the show.
Now moving up the body to their heads, right?
Yeah.
What is the basic difference between an English hood and a French hood? And why would you choose one over the other?
Yeah, so the English hood and the French hood are they're quite distinct in terms of their appearance. So the English hood, or the Gable hood, is another name for it. Is that sort of classic, more boxy shaped hood. It always reminds me of the cuckoo bird like houses in clocks.
Yes.
The way that it's shaped.
Right. Oh, that's funny. And now, of course, that's what I'm going to think of every single time I ever see one, because you're totally right about that.
I know. I'm so sorry. So yeah, it has well, that's why it's called a gable hood as well, I guess, because gables being to do with a roof. So it does look like a roofed structure that, I guess, it looks like a house. Yeah. And so that's the English hood. That's the earliest version. And it's interesting. I think in a lot of films and TV, they show Anne Boleyn, for example, is always wearing a French hood. But we actually think she never really wore French hoods that much. The only surviving image that we have of Anne Boleyn comes from a coin. And in that, she's actually wearing a gable hood, or an English hood. So a French hood, on the other hand, I think is the hood that most people prefer. Aesthetically, I think to modern eyes, it's a lot nicer. So it's the more rounded hood that you usually see in a lot of period dramas. And I think, TV productions, they prefer using that hood as well. But that was a French hood because it came from France. It was quite popular in France. In England, it definitely came into fashion. And, as most sort of French fashions did. But the gable hood was still, or the English hood was still quite popular as well.
Poor Jane Seymour and Catherine of Aragon. Now, every time I look at a picture of them, I'm going to picture a cuckoo bird coming out of their hood.
I'm so sorry about that. That's all I think of every time.
Oh, that's too funny. So, okay, so now we're up top. We'll stay above the neck now. We talked about the hoods. What about skincare? Does that count as fashion for you? Because one listener asked about eating gold leaf to make their skin glow. So there's that. And then, of course, we all know the lengths to which Elizabeth I went to appear, beautiful and youthful with the crazy makeup and stuff. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, of course. I've actually never heard of them eating gold leaf before, but that sort of does, I think, that question is really interesting because it does speak to the beauty culture of the time and the work. So Erin Griffey, she's an associate professor of art history at the University of Auckland. She's looking into her new researches on beauty particularly during the 17th century. And she and others have found some really interesting beauty recipes, would you say? So the equivalent of skincare. And there was actually, I think a lot of people, our understanding is, as you said, like Elizabeth I wearing these sort of crazy heavy makeup. We think of people in the theatre, for example, again, wearing these, lead and mercury-based face paints. But actually at the time, there was much more emphasis on what we would call now, and, as there is now as well in modern beauty culture, on skincare, on trying to not just cover up your skin, but to sort of maintain the skin's health and sort of beauty from within, so to speak. So actually the lead and mercury-based paints, they're sort of not as common as we think that they are. And they certainly, if they weren't sort of caked on like we think of. They definitely were around. So at the time they were called fucus. And there's a lot of, in literature, in moralizing treatises, in sort of English plays and city comedies, there's always a lot of people making fun of women wearing these face paints, but we actually don't think it was as common as these sort of, literature is making it out to be. So in the beauty sort of books that we find from the period and the recipe books, there's actually much more emphasis, and they do contain some recipes that are, to make these sorts of face paints, or what we would call, I guess it would be similar to sort of the modern sort of water. There's a lot of now like modern sort of foundations that are sort of serums as well. So they're very sheer, and they're not really supposed to correct blemishes necessarily, but they're supposed to sort of make your skin glow and sort of give you that beautiful, this is my natural skin. So there are actually recipes for that. They were often made from animal fats, for example. And so they're supposed to be translucent, but also make your skin look nice. But there was also a lot of emphasis on skincare to sort of obtain a blemish-free white complexion. Again, obviously, we're talking about England. White skin was the beauty ideal at the time. So lovely blemish-free white skin, rosy cheeks, which sort of doesn't really change much for the next few hundred years. But there's a lot of emphasis, on skincare. Erin's actually been remaking some of these skincare recipes. A lot of them were made using, basic herbs like rosemary, things like that. You get, I've found references to spermaceti, so especially by the late 17th century. So that's a whale oil. And they would often make rouge as well. So from Brazil wood, sandalwood, cochineal, that type of thing. But there's a lot more emphasis in this period on actual skin care and taking care of your skin and sort of skincare products to get rid of blemishes, rather than these sort of heavy lead-based paints that we think of.
And did everyone have access to these types of herbs and fats and, the different things to care for your skin that they were using? Or was that just an upper class thing?
No, I mean, definitely some of these things were just upper class, particularly, Brazil wood, for example, or spermaceti. But a lot of lower class people would have had access to these sorts of, a lot of them are basic, sort of what we think of as basic English garden herbs. A lot of the fats are just animal fats, beeswax, that type of thing. And a lot of these recipe books that we're looking at, I wouldn't say they're really low class, but they're not courtiers either. And I think a lot of these recipes would have filtered somewhat down to the lower classes. And I think, people in the lower classes, I think it's sort of a myth to think that they didn't care about how they looked. They definitely did. And, if the prevailing cultural beauty standard is, fair white skin, I think it's fair to say that a lot of, lower class women in particular would have strived to sort of, meet that beauty ideal. So they're definitely, a lot of these recipes would have been easy to make for lower class people who had access, to a herb garden, for example.
Now, speaking of the lower class, were there restrictions on who could wear certain types of clothing or styles or whatever? And I'm not necessarily speaking about access to things, because of course money would play a role in what you were able to wear. But for lack of a better word, were there certain things that certain levels of people were not necessarily, quote, permitted to be wearing?
Yeah, so definitely during the 16th century, we have something, and beforehand, something called sumptuary legislation. And so this was common in, most European countries during this period. England's sumptuary legislation actually isn't as extensive or as harsh, for lack of a better word, than a lot of continental European sumptuary legislations. So in England, various sumptuary laws had existed since the 15th century. Most of them only were concerned, though, with men's dress. So it's not actually until Elizabeth comes to power that we get our first sumptuary legislation that targets women. But all sumptuary legislation in England, whether it was targeted at men and women, actually didn't really target the types of garments worn necessarily. Like, it didn't restrict a garment to a certain population. It was mainly concerned with the types of fabrics, colours, and trims that were used in clothing, rather than the type of garment itself. So, for example, I've just, was having a look before, and, an example of an Elizabethan era sumptuary legislation for men's clothing, for example, was that, viscounts and barons and other persons of sort of, like degree were allowed to wear cloth of silver, tinselled satin, silk, or a cloth mixed or embroidered with any gold in doublets, jerkins, and linings of cloaks and gowns and hose. So it was these types of things, like you're allowed to wear this type of fabric in this type of garment. And for women, it was similar as well. So, for example, an Elizabethan sumptuary law against women says none shall wear any cloth of gold, tissue, nor fur of sables, except duchesses, marquises, and countesses in their gowns, kirtles, partlets, and sleeves. So you have this type of sumptuary legislation, and the point of sumptuary legislation was to really protect the inherited privileges of the elite. It was to make them stand out from the rest of the population by restricting what the rest of the population could wear.
So then, while we're on the topic with the sumptuary laws, what other laws did the lower class have to follow as far as fashion?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and one that is quite related to the sumptuary legislation that I was talking about previously. So there weren't any laws necessarily besides the sumptuary laws that I'd already mentioned, which sort of aren't really well followed anyway. But we do have a really interesting example in England, in London, from 1611, which is when the Grocers' Company, so in London you had various livery companies that controlled various professions within the city. And so you have one from the Grocers' Company that tried to limit what apprentices and maids could wear. And it's a really interesting look into, again, what people were actually wearing, but what I guess this wasn't necessarily a law in terms of it's not a state law. But it was a law within in the city of London. And so people, according to this document, if they were caught breaking these rules, they would get fined. But we don't really hear much about this legislation after, it comes in. So we don't know how well it was followed. But for example, it sort of says no apprentices, so male apprentices, weren't allowed to wear Piccadilly collars, which Piccadilly collars are these sort of, they're similar to a ruff, which I think we will talk about in a little bit. But by the Jacobean period, by 1611, they're these large wire structures that would support either a ruff or a collar, and they sort of surround the head. So it says they're not allowed to wear those. They're not allowed to wear velvet in their hats. They're not allowed to wear things like silk breeches, for example, which tells us that all these apprentices were wearing all of these things. I think, when people could afford it, or if they could get their hands on garments like this through the secondhand clothing trade, they definitely did. And then, for example, it says that maids aren't allowed to wear ruffs. They're not allowed to wear silk petticoats or waistcoats or gowns. They're not allowed to use silk lace. They're not allowed to put wire or whalebone in their bodies or sleeves. So this is a really interesting example of not necessarily a law, but a restriction, that was tried to, that they tried to put in place. But I think it's more telling of what people were actually wearing at the time, which was, much more varied and sort of socially mobile than we would usually think about.
Let's go back to what you were just saying about a ruff. I think that we probably have to clarify for most people, including myself, what is that?
Yeah, so a ruff is a pleated linen collar So they originated from the collars of smocks and shirts, which we talked about previously. So it's sort of interesting to see over the 16th century they grow in size. So it sort of started as the little frill around the collar of a smock or a shirt that sort of slowly started to grow in size and appearance out of from this garment that sits underneath the outer clothing and sort of started to peek through. And then by sort of the mid to late 16th century, it becomes a totally separate accessory in itself. So it's yards and yards of linen, beautiful white linen that has been, bleached and then starched. So starched using something like wheat starch, for example, during this period. And then it is set and pleated. So it's sort of bundled up into these pleats, which are set using hot irons until it creates this sort of round pleated collar that was worn around the neck. And so they could come in various sort of sizes. Some were, it's around probably the 1590s, 1600 that they become huge in size. That's sort of, I guess, their biggest, when they get the biggest in size. And then they slowly start to fall out of fashion or sort of start to get smaller again during the Jacobean period. And during the Jacobean period, you also have something like Rabato or Piccadilly collar. So these are sort of wired or other structures. So pasteboard was used, whalebone could be used, and they could support the ruff, or they could support what started to become more fashionable, which was just a plain linen band, which then if you sort of look throughout the 17th century, they start to just become fall-in collars. So the neckwear can get quite extreme during this period, but it sort of ebbs and flows as well in terms of size and shape.
Well, moving on from the ruff, we had a lot of listeners, excuse me, writing in very concerned about the difficulty of getting dressed in this time. It's such a foreign concept, right? So everybody's like, what? All the layers? What are you supposed to do with all that?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So now I know that England is not necessarily known for its tropical climate, right?
Yeah.
But when it did get warm, what pieces could women remove or leave out so that they could stay cool?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because this period is actually the period of the Little Ice Age in Europe. In the world, I guess.
So nothing, add more layers,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, so it was actually a lot colder in this period than it is now. Like the Thames would regularly freeze over. You would, there was a lot of bad harvests. They're found in, the natural record. For example, like tree growth rings. They've found lots of evidence of the Little Ice Age during this period. So it was actually colder during this period, which is why, when we think of all these woolen fabrics that they're wearing and all these like crazy layers, how were they not so hot? Well, they actually didn't get as hot as it does now. But I would say in terms of trying to keep cool, a farthingale, for example, was a great structure to keep the fabric away from the legs and to keep cool. So I think a lot of people think of these garments as being really cumbersome and like, how did they, walk around in those, for example? But they actually served a purpose to keep the skirts away from the legs. So if you were dancing, for example, you wouldn't trip up on your skirts. Or, in this period, if, it was quite a hot day, it actually would provide a bit of relief from, around the legs. And there's actually sort of one of the myths about how the hoop petticoat or the panniers of the 18th century came about is that in Paris, in like 1711, it was a really hot day. And so, these women, they put together this hooped structure to wear under their skirts to keep their skirts away from their legs.
Well, that's brilliant.
Yeah. But I would say mostly it's you may have, not worn as many petticoats, for example, and you definitely wouldn't have worn drawers. But I would say mostly during this period, it's actually a lot colder than we think it is. So they probably didn't have to deal too much with heat unless they were going to somewhere, like Jamestown, for example, in America or in more tropical climates. But even then, they probably would have just opted, for. But even in Jamestown, all of the records, the research that's been done there show that they were wearing a lot of wool. But wool is quite, being a natural fiber, it actually can be quite cool as well. But I'd say mostly they just sort of got on with it, and it was a little bit colder than it is now.
Right. Well, I feel like we're chatting so much about women's fashion
Yeah.
that we'd really be remiss if we don't chat a little bit about the men, right?
Yeah.
So why don't you give us kind of a little overview about what men's top to bottom outfits would look like?
Yeah, of course. Well, I'll go inside to outside because that's probably easiest.
Yes, inside to outside. That's better. Thank you.
So men would have worn a shirt, which I've mentioned before. It's that basic linen undergarment that everybody wore. And then after that, they would have put on a pair of hose, which, depending on the period you're looking at, they could cover you from waist to feet. So that's probably more common in the early 16th century, or waist to knee, and then you would wear a pair of stockings. So waist to knee are called like upper hose, and they are what later become breeches in the 17th century, the late 16th and the 17th century. And so there are many types of hose during this period. You've got Venetian, you've got trunk hose, so some are quite slim fitted, particularly in the early 16th century. And in the late 16th century, they sort of balloon out to all different proportions. There is actually, sumptuary legislation that talks about men's hose and how trying to restrict their size, the amount of fabric you can put into them because they're just getting too big. So again, that's an example of not really restricting the type of garment, but maybe restricting how much fabric is allowed to go into the garment. And in the hose is where you also get the codpiece, which I think is, the most fascinating part of men's clothing during the late 15th and 16th century. So initially the codpiece was, I guess it sort of served the purpose of a modern fly in men's trousers. So it allowed men to like relieve themselves. It was just a flap of fabric that they could undo. But over time, it becomes very stiff and structured and almost phallic-like in appearance. There's been a lot written about codpieces. They are extremely interesting if you're thinking about them in terms of early modern masculinity. But they sort of reach their extreme, I guess, in the mid to late 16th century, and then they sort of go away or sort of regress again in size. So then on the torso over the linen shirt, you would have a doublet, which is a sleeved garment that covered the torso. So the equivalent of what a woman's bodice would be, for example, or a waistcoat. And these could be, they're usually quite close fitting. They could be padded or boned even. And they often held up the hose and the breeches. So you would attach the hose and the breeches to the bottom of the doublet. And then over that, you could wear something called a jerkin, which was similar to a doublet, but it had no sleeves. It's sort of like modern puffer vests, I guess. So it would give you extra warmth over your torso, but they're often made from things like leather, for example. And then on top of that, you could wear a gown, a long gown, which is sort of like what you graduate in now if you go to university or college. And then you could wear cloaks and cassocks and that type of thing. And then you obviously had various types of accessories. So, ruffs or hats, falling bands, that type of thing. So that was sort of basic men's dress during this period.
I feel like we've really covered the whole, gamut of fashion and clothing and everything. So I want to say thank you again for joining us. Before I let you go, I'm definitely going to have to thank our listeners who wrote in, among which we have Katie Ray, Julie Rowan, Allie, Macathern, I'm sorry, Allie, Kathleen Verwip, Catherine Stevenson, Doug Breeden, Elena Azadbach, Stacy Stark. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to everybody for listening. Thank you for always participating in our Ask the Expert. We couldn't do it without you. So again, thanks a lot. And Sarah Bendall, our expert today, who is the author of Shaping Femininity, Foundation Garments, the Body and Women in Early Modern England. Did I get all that right, Sarah?
Yes.
Perfect. So everybody go out and get her book if you want to learn any more or anything further from what we've been talking about today. And again, I'm going to make sure that everybody follows you. You said you have a Twitter and an Instagram and some pictures that you want to share with us that we'll definitely put in the show notes so that everybody can follow along as you describe all these wonderful pieces of clothing. So thank you again, Sarah, for joining us.
No, thank you so much for having me. I hope that, I answered all your burning questions.
You sure did. We can't wait to have you back. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. You can follow and support the Tudors Dynasty Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Patreon @Tudors Dynasty.